What is going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. So it has been an absolute roller coaster over the last 24 hours if you're a Boston Bruins fan with these Jeremy Swayman contract negotiations. Up first, yesterday morning, we had Cam Neely come out and say, I have 64 million reasons why I'd be playing right now, alluding to the fact that they offered him a contract worth $64 million, most likely 8 years, $8 million. So people started to be like, Swayman, you should sign that. Although I agree, he should hold out for like 8.25, 8.5. But then Louis Gross, Swayman's agent, the agent he also represented William Nylander, came out and basically said that $64 million number that was referenced, that was the first time that number was discussed in our negotiations. No offer was ever made reaching that level. We're extremely disappointed. This was not fair to Jeremy. We will take a few days to discuss where we go from here. So there is no deal imminent. The Boston Bruins open their season in 7 days at this point, a week from today, next Tuesday. So although I am not saying that he is going to get traded tomorrow, that he's going to get traded at all, at this point, it is at least a possibility, considering the fact they are publicly beefing when looking at it. And if Swayman's camp, we don't know what exactly they want, but if they want $9 million and they haven't even offered like $8 million per, then there is a clear impasse between these two parties. So I decided it would be a fun idea to turn it over to you guys and ask you guys for hypothetical Jeremy Swayman trades. Now, when looking at it, it would be very tough. These deals are pretty complex. I made sure to make sure that these are cap compliant to a degree. Consider the fact if Jeremy Swayman was getting traded last June, last July, teams would have basically like 25 teams probably would have been on Jeremy Swayman because he's a 25-year-old, because he's an absolute stud. There's definitely limited suitors considering the fact that teams are pretty cap tight, and also at this point they have their starting goalies heading into next season. So we're going to go through some of these. I think some of these could make some solid sense for both parties, but without further ado, let's get into it. And up first, we have Swayman for Jari McGrody in a conditional first. This would be a big price. I think they would only have to attach either McGrody or a first, or like McGrody in a second, a first in a second, to Tristan Jari. We're looking at it, this could make some sense. Tristan Jari, I think he's kind of overhated. He's a solid starter, slightly above average in some seasons. Outside of last year, which I know the most recent year definitely matters the most, he had at least a 909 each of the last 4 years. So I think Tristan Jari, if that's what the Boston Bruins ended up having to run out, that wouldn't be the worst thing. Getting a guy like Rucker McGrody that is still a young prospect, but could be a pretty impact player next season, and within 2 to 3 years be a legit 60 to 65 point guy, that'd actually be a pretty solid deal. And we're looking at it for the Pittsburgh Penguins. I think they would have to attach some salary because they're up against it. They have a couple bad contracts they could probably do with that. But when looking at it, they definitely need a kind of elevator like a Jeremy Swayman. And I think Swayman on like an 8-year, $8.25 million deal in Pittsburgh would make a lot of sense. Next up with the Washington Capitals, Swayman for Charlie Lindgren, Ivan Miroshevchenko, I believe it is the last name. I might botch that. Their 2022 first round pick, a 2025 first, top 8 protected. This deal, you need to add some salary filler, but I do think Charlie Lindgren, after having a fantastic season last year where he was a top 12 guy, considering he is pretty cost effective, the Capitals would probably have to add a legit roster player to this kind of deal when looking at a guy like Rasmus Sandin, a Martin Ferravari maybe attached to this kind of guy, but you're not just going to get Charlie Lindgren in an unproven prospect in a protected first round pick. You'd have to add a legit, probably solid NHLer at this point if you're going to be upgrading from Charlie Lindgren to Jeremy Swayman. The Anaheim Ducks, Gibson and Zegras plus a first round pick. When looking at this, either Gibson, probably Zegras maybe, would have to be half retained given the fact that the Bruins would be taking on more salary, considering Gibson makes around $6 million. Zegras also makes around $6 million. So when looking at this, I think this deal could make some sense to a degree when looking at John Gibson, considering the fact he's maybe a bounce back candidate, really has not been good the last 2 years. And when looking at Trevor Zegras, I'm not saying he developed into like a franchise number one center, but he definitely has some serious offensive potential. If you can figure out some of his defensive weaknesses, he could end up being potentially this Boston Bruins first line center in like 2 to 3 years. I still think there's a bunch of potential with Trevor Zegras and adding that first round pick. Maybe you could get him down to a second round pick, but I think, yeah, Gibson's contract is kind of negative value at this point. So it does make some sense. Next up, we got the Minnesota Wild, Ryan Hartman, that is, in a first round pick. This one makes some solid sense. When looking at Gustafson. I believe he's the same age as Swayman, maybe a year older, making only $3.75 million next season. Great in 2023, pretty disappointing in 2024. Ryan Hartman, solid middle sixer, making only $4 million in that first round pick. I think Minnesota should be around the playoff team, but it definitely has some value. That one, in my opinion, makes a lot of sense. Next up, we got the Detroit Red Wings. Billy Husso, William Willander, or Wallander, I think, 2026 second, 2025 third, and Trey Augustine. This one, I don't know about this one, considering the fact that I think like value-wise, them getting Trey Augustine is fantastic. He'd hopefully be their goalie of their future. But Billy Husso actively sucks right now, so that's probably a problem. If you made it Cam Talbot and then threw in like, I don't know, you have to throw in some kind of salary filler, a guy that has shorter term. I'm trying to think, do they have any of those guys kind of like that? Compher and Kopp are kind of locked up long term. But I think they would definitely want Cam Talbot if we're talking from the Detroit Red Wings, because at the end of the day, if they're trading Jeremy Swayman, they need some type of goaltender in return that can play serious games next year. They're not trading away Swayman and then giving the starting job just straight up to Korpisalo. Next up, the Sabres, sticking in the Atlantic Division. UPL and Byram. I guess this could make some sense. Mason Lohrei would kind of get kicked out of the lineup. Boston's defense core would get even more absolutely stacked. And UPL is on an extension. I believe, what is it, 5 years, $4.5 million? Then Buffalo, who has the cap space to do this kind of move, to give Jeremy Swayman big money. Again, there is some apprehension doing this within the division, but I think that's actually pretty solid value for both parties. That's one of the best deals that we have seen thus far. Toronto Maple Leafs, Joseph Woll, Easton Cowan, Nick Robertson in a first round pick. That would be a decent amount to give up. If they were Toronto Maple Leafs and Boston Bruins, I think the value is pretty fair there. A guy that actually I think is a year older than Jerry Swayman, but still a pretty young goaltender in Joseph Woll that, when healthy, is very good. It is locked up for the next 3 years at a perfectly reasonable $3.66 million. Don't think you'd have to throw on a first round pick on top of that, considering you're already trading away Easton Cowan, who's projecting like a very good first round pick at this point. But yeah, I get where you're coming from that perspective. Not going to happen though, considering the Leafs and the Bruins. The Bruins and the Wings trading is a pretty foreign concept. Giving them Jeremy Swayman. Leafs, I cannot exactly see. The San Jose Sharks, Askarov, Granlund in a second. I get where he's coming from here when looking at it. Askarov, I think he's going to be a stud in 2 to 3 years. The only problem is, again, Boston would have to rely on a Korpisalo and Askarov tandem. I think the value is there long term, but in terms of the short term, Boston's still trying to win with this core heading into next season. The Seattle Kraken, a conditional first round pick, David Goyette, who was very good, I believe, last year in the OHL, and Joey Decord. I think Joey Decord makes some sense. Joey Decord, funny enough, from Massachusetts. Jeremy Swayman from Anchorage, Alaska. So return him to the Pacific Northwest. Return Decord back to Boston. So in looking at it, I think that the Kraken would have to add one of their like solid forwards in this. Maybe you package a Jordan Eberle, I'm trying to think, an Oliver Bjorkstrand, something like that, to this kind of deal, considering the fact that just swapping Decord and Swayman and then Goyette maybe turns into something, a first round pick 4 to 5 years away. If you attach an actual roster player to this kind of deal, I think it could make some sense, considering Decord is pretty cheap and really was good last year for Seattle. Seattle, probably a top 12 goalie in the entire NHL. Definitely something could potentially work with those two players. The Vancouver Canucks, Demko and a pick for Swayman, extended 8x8 in Vancouver. Now I'm looking at Demko. It's just the injuries are so concerning, and he also is 3 years older than Jeremy Swayman. But if you knew Demko was going to be healthy the next 2 years, I think the value actually is pretty solid on the two of them, considering the fact Demko has 2 years left at $5 million. But I'm not sure. Boston, again, it would have to be like a first round pick probably for Boston to do that, considering the fact if Demko, if he's hurt this season, if he's hurt for the rest of his career, again, they're going to be relying on Korpisalo to play massive games. The Utah Hockey Club, Connor Ingram, Jack McBain in 2 second round picks. Connor Ingram would be a pretty decent piece for the Boston Bruins to get. Was, again, similar to Decord, probably a top 12 goalie in the NHL last year, has 2 years left at $1.95 million. My proposal for the Utah Hockey Club was Ingram in Lawson Krause. Get yourself a very good 20-20, hard-nosed, big-hitting kind of middle six winger that can immediately impact your team, compared to Jack McBain, who's a little bit younger, not as proven. I think that would make a little bit more sense. But again, I think Utah trying to go out and get a guy like Jeremy Swayman or just any big-name goalie next offseason, if I don't know if Ingram's the guy for the future. And as a result, I think Utah should be somewhat aggressive. We got the Edmonton Oilers, Swayman for Skinner and Hyman. And I understand you guys wanting to upgrade over Stuart Skinner. I think that he's a little bit erratic at times, although he really did show up between games 4 and 7 in the playoffs last year. He was lights out. The problem with this is Zach Hyman is one of the best contracts in the NHL. Zach Hyman has 4 years left at $5.5 million. I'm sure the Oilers would be interested in a Jeremy Swayman, but Skinner's only making like $2.6 million the next 3 years. He's on a very good contract. So I don't think that you would go that aggressive for a guy like Jeremy Swayman, considering the fact that the other two guys, just to pay Jeremy Swayman what he wants, which again, I think he's worth 8 by 8.5, but it's not that much surplus value. Compare that to a Zach Hyman that was a legit like $9 to $10 million player last year, should be for the next 2 to 3 years. And Stuart Skinner, even if he's an average starter at $2.6 million, that's fantastic value. So I'm not that big on that kind of move. From that, Georgiev, Ritchie, and Colton for Swayman and Kastelik. I think that can make some sense. A lot of people are down on Alexander Georgiev, and rightfully so, considering the fact he had like an 897 in the regular season last year, but he did have a 918 in 2023. There's some value to that. Callum Ritchie, I think, is going to be a very damn good NHL player in a couple years. Maybe next year he can play like a solid middle six role for Colorado. Would Colorado be that aggressive in terms of trading a young, cheap guy to get their franchise center? When looking at it, then they'd be paying like McKinnon 12.5, Rantanen going to get an extension around 12 or McKinnon's 12.6. Rantanen 12.25, McCarr's up in 2 to 3 years, paying those 4 players. They're all fantastic, but kind of committing a lot of your cap to those top 4 guys would be interesting. I think the value is pretty solid on them on that kind of deal. Ross Colton also is a very solid player. And then lastly, the Philadelphia Flyers, Urson, the Avs first, Scott Laughton, and Jeremy Swayman. I think for a deal like this, it would definitely have to be like a Morgan Frost kind of guy, a young guy that just had 47 points at the center position that actually has some serious potential compared to a Scott Laughton that's kind of just like a good third liner at this point. The problem is Sam Ersson is just completely unproven at this point. When looking at it, talking about before, is he that much of an upgrade over Korpisalo? I'm not so sure, but I think Philadelphia should be aggressive in terms of targeting some kind of goaltender. They probably should have been on like an Linus Ullmark or something, or maybe a Markstrom if they wanted to take that next step. So when looking at it, I'm not sure that Swayman for Ersson, anything centered around that, it would have to be a massive package of other pieces, like a goddamn Cam York or something like that. And Philadelphia is clearly not going to do that. But let me know in the comments, what do you think about these hypotheticals? Again, it's really hard considering we're a week out from the start of the season. Teams do not have a lot of salary cap space. Drop your own hypotheticals down below. I'll be seeing you in the next one.